why did the sanctions not bring the Russian economy to its knees, in your opinion?
Well, there are several reasons. Probably the most important one is that the United States, which designed the sanction program, as I think you know, or I hope you know, the United States has been busy sanctioning countries for quite a few years now. If you want to go back half a century, they've been sanctioning Cuba, then they sanctioned Iran, then they sanctioned North Korea, and one could go on. They've done a lot, and Russia, repeatedly. So the whole idea of a sanction program, as well as the design and maintenance of a sanction program, is an American specialty, and was, in the case of Russia, was anticipated that it would be used. And I should mention China too, because it's an important part of this reason. Anyway, what the United States did was design a sanction program and then prevail on mostly its European allies to complement or implement or support, whatever you like, the sanction program. And indeed, the single most important sanction against Russia, not the only one, but the most important one, was Europe's decision to support the United States in refusing to continue to purchase Russian oil and Russian gas, because those had become very important basic sources of energy for Western Europe. And the expectation was that if the United States organized the biggest, most comprehensive sanctions program it could, building on all the previous experiments in sanctions, then they would get two results: the collapse of Russia, and therefore the inability of Russia to remain in Ukraine, let alone to continue to fight in Ukraine. But there were a number of voices in the United States who were so convinced of the effect of the sanctions program that they spoke about weakening Russia in a general way. And in some cases, they imagined Russia would disintegrate and break up into different parts that would be open to Western investment and political maneuver of the same kind that happened after 1989 in Eastern European countries, from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in the north, all the way down to Bulgaria in the south. And so this was the plan, this was the hope, this was the plan, and the sanctions would include, most importantly, cutting off exports of oil and gas for Russia, and then the extraordinary step, which in the long run will have the most important consequences, seizing Russian financial assets in Western Europe and in the United States, blocking Russia from using the international payments system. And if you understand what that means, kind of paying for the war in Iraq by seizing the Russian assets and using them to reimburse Western Europe and the United States to rebuild Ukraine once the Russians had been forced out. This was, broadly speaking, the dream, the hope, the plan. Okay, so why did it fail? Well, for two or three reasons, but I'm going to concentrate on the most important ones. The most important ones had to do with the fact that European and American strategy did not understand the relationships that had been built up between Russia and other countries around the world. Above all, China, but also India. And beyond that, the BRICS. And beyond that, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And beyond that, much of what we call now the Global South. These areas had developed economic relationships of great importance, not so much with Russia, but with China. And because of the determination of Russia and China to work together in response to the American sanctions, all of this support was mobilized. And the mobilization took, again, many forms, but I'm going to concentrate on two of them. Number one, that these countries, led by China and India, would purchase Russian oil and gas in huge quantities. Not only would they purchase the oil and gas for their own use, but they would work together with many countries which would buy Russian oil and gas and then resell it to the Europeans, because it was now called Nigerian oil and gas, or Malaysian oil and gas, or, Peruvian oil and gas. Since these weren't sanctioned, and it is very difficult to identify where oil and gas come from once they get moved around, they were able to continue to provide Europe with Russian oil and gas, but they called it something else. And it was much more expensive because they had to be paid to play this game. And so they bought Russian oil and gas, but they raised the price in order for the Europeans to get it. But in many cases, it was still cheaper than buying liquefied natural gas from the United States, which is what Europe was increasingly being forced to do. And the second way that the West misunderstood is that they did not see the extent of the cooperation and the determination of many countries around the world to reduce their dependence on the US dollar and to shift their economic dependence to be shared. They would still hold US dollars, not the way they did before, not as many as before, but they would continue to hold US dollars and trade in US dollars, but they would increasingly do it also in Chinese yuan and in the currencies of a number of countries, including Russia, if they would be backed by either gold or the Chinese yuan. And basically what the BRICS countries did was make a commitment to guarantee trade in yuan and to promise to move, which they're going to do this coming week, to support the yuan with gold. Long story short, Russia was able to utilize its relationships with China, India, the BRICS, and other parts of the world as a substitute and an offset to the sanctions impact from the West. That was why Russia didn't fall to its knees or nothing like that.
If we look at the number of countries that were invited to this BRICS summit, it seems like a revolution against the US dollar. Everybody wants to join BRICS. What's your take on this?
Well, you know, it's something that should not surprise people except for two things. If you don't pay attention to international finance, then you're not aware of how the development over the last 20 years has led up to this point. BRICS is not a new organization. BRICS has been around for many years, and they have had conferences and meetings, and they have said what they are concerned about, and they have said what they're interested in. The real difference now is that the global South, for the first time, has a leader with real economic muscle, real economic power. And that's the new phenomena. And that means that every small country in the world now has an opportunity it did not have for most of the last century. For most of the last century, certainly after World War II, so 1945, there's been only one economic superpower. That has to be understood. The Soviet Union never was an economic competitor to the United States. And let me give you a simple statistic right now, 2023. The GDP, gross domestic product, which is a number economists use to give you an idea of how big an economy is. Strictly speaking, it measures the output of goods and services in one calendar year, 12 months. And we keep records for every country. How big is your GDP, gross domestic product? Okay, for the most recent year, 2022, the gross domestic product of the United States, roughly $22 trillion. The gross domestic product of Russia over the last year or two, $1.5 trillion. In other words, there is no similarity here. There is no equality of economic resources. One country is enormously rich and the other one isn't. You know, Britain and Italy, they have maybe $3, $4, $5 trillion economies, bigger than Russia, but nowhere near the United States. There's only one country that comes near to the United States, and that's the People's Republic of China, whose GDP last year, depending on how you count, about 17, maybe $18 trillion. That's a competitor, still significantly smaller than the United States, but huge. And when you remember that they are now the manufacturing center of the world, and you remember that they have a population 4 times larger than that of the United States, then you begin to understand that for the first time, the United States has a real serious economic competitor. And here's the reason that's so important. Every country in Latin America, every country in Africa, every country in Asia that needs to borrow money, that needs to get capital investment to build up their roads, to build up their internet infrastructure, to develop their resources of water power or solar power, they now have 2 places to go. They don't just go to the United States and Western Europe. That's what it was from 1945 to the present. They now have an alternative. They can go to China. They can go to China plus India plus Britain plus Brazil plus Russia, etc. And they can play them against each other. They can go to China and say, will you build the railroad? Then they can go to France and Britain and will you build the railroad? And they can make a deal. They can take the better offer. And the better offer often comes from China because they're big enough and rich enough to do it. And therefore, let me put it dramatically to you. We have a different world economy now. And every player in that economy, every country on this planet is refixing, redesigning, reorganizing its economic and political and foreign policies to take account of the arrival of the Chinese achievement and the fact that countries like India and Russia and Brazil are working closely with the Chinese. They want to have an opportunity to pick and choose and play the West against the East. They don't want that to go away. They want there to be a competitor to the US dollar because they're going to get a much better deal from the United States or from the EU or from Japan if there's a competitor called the BRICS, China and its allies, that they can bargain with. And I can assure you, because I live in the United States and I was born in the United States, I've lived and worked all my life here, that huge majority of the American people do not know what I've just been talking about. There is very little discussion in this country of the changed world economy. If China comes up, it is looked upon the way the Soviet Union used to be. It's like a continuation of the Cold War, as if 1989 had never happened. There is what psychologists call a massive denial of the new world. They don't want to face it. And I understand. I'm an American, so I have some sympathy for this. Americans are being asked to watch the decline of the American empire, and they don't want it, and they don't want to see it, and they don't want to worry about it. So they are doing everything they can, either to pretend it isn't happening or to see the whole thing as a replay of the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union across most of the 20th century. It's neither of those things. It's not something you can deny, and it's not the equivalent of the struggle with the Soviet Union. Because again, and that's why I use the number, the United States is only a little richer than China, whereas the United States was always enormously richer than the Soviet Union or Russia ever were. And that reality is new, and it is producing in the United States one mistake after another. Let me give you an example of a mistake. Under President Trump, after 2016, because of his complicated political dimensions, he wanted to be friendly with Russia, as you know, with Putin and so forth. And because American politics requires an evil enemy, he made China the evil enemy. And he declared a trade war against China, and he declared a tariff war against China, which went on from 2017, right through the 4 years of his term. It was supposed to get China to change its government. It was supposed to get China to change its economic organization. It was supposed to change China's export and import. It failed on everything. It accomplished absolutely nothing. Trade between China and the United States grew every year. Investment by Americans in China grew every year. China didn't change its government. China didn't change its economic organization. It changed nothing. But it showed the world something extraordinary, that when the United States goes against another country with such power, trade war, tariff war, putting the American Navy in the South China Sea, starting to talk again about Taiwan, that it makes no difference, that it doesn't work, that the United States can say all kinds of things, do all kinds of things, threaten all kinds of things, and it doesn't matter. Many decades ago, the revolutionary leader in China, Mao Zedong, enjoyed saying that the United States was a tiger, but a tiger made out of paper, a paper tiger. In other words, it wasn't really a tiger, it was only the picture of a tiger. But people didn't believe him. They thought the United States was a real tiger. When everything Trump did failed, and by the way, Biden is continuing what Trump did and continuing to fail, the rest of the world is given a very profound lesson. The United States as a superpower keeps failing. It cannot achieve, it cannot regain its superpower status. It either gives that up, or it's going to have to fight a nuclear war with Russia and China, and that's an unspeakably stupid thing to do. And that, at least for the time being, the leadership in the United States seems to understand that. So they're stuck. They can't fight a nuclear war, but they can't stop watching the disintegration of the American empire. It's a very difficult situation, which is why you see very bizarre behavior. One day after the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, or the Secretary of the Treasury, Ms. Yellen, goes to Beijing, sits down with Xi Jinping or other high officers of the Chinese government, talks about we have to learn to live together, we have to work things out. One day later, the president who sent them there refers to Xi Jinping as an evil dictator. This is chaos. It makes no sense. What are the Chinese supposed to do? Are we actually going to work something out, or are you declaring war? I mean, what? This chaos is also demonstrating to the world that the United States is stuck, doesn't know where to go, doesn't know how to proceed. Last point, the collapse of the dollar. That's because the dollar is as a world currency was a way for many countries to be unable to develop themselves. The United States could at any time destroy their currency. It could, for example, have a period of time when loans are 0% interest, like the first 20 years of this century. Interest rates were brought down. You lend money here, that money then goes to, like, I'll pick a country, Malaysia, and you have cheap, low-interest loans to Malaysia, but they're made in dollars. The Federal Reserve decides to control an inflation in the United States by raising interest rates. So what are the Malaysians going to do? When their loans come due, normally they'd roll over the loan. If they owe the US $2 billion, they will borrow a new $2 billion to pay off the old $2 billion. The problem is the old $2 billion had a 0.5%, and the new $2 billion have 5%. They can't afford. They can't do that. They can't do it, and they're completely destroyed. Their plans, their commitments, their foreign reserves. They can't function because they depend on the U.S. dollar. They have to be behaving. They have to get dollars because, for example, Saudi Arabia will not sell them oil unless they can pay in dollars. They have to. They're trapped. Suddenly, they have an option. China will sit down with them and let them pay for oil with something else. You know what they might pay, allow them to pay with oil? They might allow them to pay with rubles, which means the Russians can use rubles to buy rubber from Malaysia, which they never could do before, because the Malaysians can take the rubles and buy oil from China. You know, that nobody needs the dollar anymore. No one is dependent on the dollar. No one's currency is backed by a dollar reserve, which can disappear if the Federal Reserve raises interest rates. If you put all that together, what you're seeing is the loss of the United States of its economic dominance. It's in the dollar. It's in the failure to control China. It's in the fact that China and its allies, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these are alternative developmental money houses that every smaller country can begin to access. That's why you're seeing so many small countries, they want to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or they want to join the BRICS. They don't want to be left out of being in a position to choose, to let the West and the East bid for their support. The Russians tried to do that, but they never had enough money to make that work. The Chinese do. And that's a radical difference that many people in the world do not yet understand.
One of the greatest events that has happened in 2022, in September 2022, was the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. We know that Europe's economy is in trouble. From the car production in Europe was increasing up until 2022. And from 2022 to 2023, it was a drastic reduction of 36%. How do you see the Europe's economy considering the sabotage and all the difficulties they're facing right now?
Here's my answer to your question. There are two Europes now. Europe is effectively split, not in the way you might think. It's not Eastern Europe or Western Europe. It's not the Europe in the EU, the Europe not in the EU yet. The important difference is in every country. It's a difference between those political and economic interests who want to keep the alliance with the United States. They are used to that. It has been the political reality now for just about 75 years. Many of these leaders have built their careers on that they are anti-communist, anti-socialist. They're the Conservative Party in Germany. They're the Conservative Party in England. They're the Conservative parties in Italy, in France, everywhere. And they are committed to the alliance with the United States. But here's the problem. The alliance with the United States now requires mobilizing in support of Ukraine against Russia, supporting and joining in the sanctions against Russia, and also joining more moderately in the U.S. war with China, which is all of these three things are going on at the same time. And there is a growing part of Europe inside every country that doesn't want to pay the enormous economic and political costs of staying with the United States. So Europe, for example, has an inflation now twice that of the United States because the sanctions have driven up the price of oil and gas and energy, driven up the price of food for all the reasons that people more or less understand. And the result is that the Europeans are being competed, or if you like, priced out of the market. China and its allies on the one hand, the United States and its allies on the other, they didn't have an explosion in the price of energy. They didn't have an explosion in the price of food. Again, let me give you just some statistics which so many people don't know, even though they are very public, right? Europe has been struggling with inflation rates above 10% in most of the different countries. The United States had that, but has brought it down now. But what is the inflation rate in China? Zero. Nothing. Last year, it was half of 1% or three-quarters. In other words, when you hear President Biden talk about inflation, well, yes, we have it, but it is everywhere in the world. That's not true. He's just lying. Why would he bother to lie about something which in 10 seconds going on Google, you can find out what the numbers are? It's very strange behavior. Well, the answer is they have got a crisis on their hands. There are businessmen. I'll give you some examples. One of the former heads of the HSBC Bank, that's the largest bank in Europe, has been telling everybody that he can speak to. Cowper, he has a hyphenated last name. Cowles Cowper or something close to that. But I'm interested in him because he is saying to everybody, Europe is making a terrible mistake. It's betting on the wrong horse in the race. His implication, you should bet on China, not on the United States. The United States is an empire going down, and China is an empire coming up. And Europe is making a terrible, terrible mistake. I'll give you another example. One of the highest executives in the South Korean corporation, Samsung. It's now a global corporation, makes telephones and everything else. I believe a woman, but I'm not sure. But she's now a member of the South Korean parliament. She basically made a statement 2 weeks ago saying, if the United States continues its America First sanction program, they will organize Asia to turn against America. Now, my background is European. So I speak French and I speak German. So I follow events in Europe, even though I'm an American. And I can assure you that right below the surface of the conservative parties that dominate Europe, most of Europe, not in Portugal, not in Spain, but in most of the other countries, the conservatives dominate. Right below them are the business community. And the business community is not happy with being destroyed because they can't compete in the world since the energy price is too high in Europe and the food is too high and the workers are getting angry about what's happening to their standard of living. And the governments are having to help workers pay for energy, help workers pay for food, which means they can't do the other things they're expected to do for the employer class. You're building a political explosion in Europe. And Europe is being torn apart just below the surface. I, for example, would not be surprised if over the next 2 or 3 years, you saw a sudden swing of European politics sharply to the left, saying to the socialists, the communists, and whoever else, anti-capitalist parties, okay, now you try to do something because the right wing, which is in power, has failed. The right wing is presiding over a Europe that is being destroyed by the tension between the United States and China. It is, for example, obvious if you follow the politics in Great Britain that the Conservative Party there is dying. It's falling apart. It cannot hold together. The last 3 or 4 prime ministers have been a joke. This one is a joke. The woman before was a joke. Boris Johnson was a bad joke. And the Labour Party is simply waiting to come in and take over. Not that the Labour Party is all that different, but it's the population that looks at the conservatives and says, you've been in power for a long time, and the situation of Europe keeps getting worse.
If we consider the situation of Ukraine right now, we know that they lost a big part of their economy to Russia. And if they lose Odessa and Nikolaev, they're gonna lose their access to the Black Sea.
Right.
And how do you see the future of Ukraine?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I come from a family that was very badly hurt in World War II. Many of my relatives died in that war. So for me, I look at the photographs coming from Ukraine, and I'm horrified. No population should be forced to go through that. My parents became refugees. Millions of Ukrainians have become refugees and have gone, to Poland or any of many countries that they have run to. And I know enough to know, like with my parents, that refugees often don't come back. And the Ukraine has lost territory. The Ukraine has lost many cities. The Ukraine has lost millions of its people. I mean, this is a tragedy on a scale, and for me, therefore, the only question really is, how can we stop this? Because what's going on is a war between the United States and China. That's the real issue. That is being fought as a war between the United States and Europe and Russia, and everybody's fighting to the last Ukrainian. This should not be allowed. It's crazy that people who aren't Ukrainians are in a position to destroy Ukraine. It's horrible. So my first interest, how do we get this to stop? But I understand that there are differences of opinion. I think for Ukraine at this point, they have a terribly difficult situation, because if they don't help bring this to an end, I don't think there will be a Ukraine. Between what the Russians will do, and look, I'm no military expert. I don't pretend to be, but as a lay person who knows about Europe, who studies Europe, I speak European languages. I always have. Ukraine is not winning this war. Russia is, which shouldn't come as a surprise because Russia is a very big, powerful, rich relative to Ukraine, which isn't those things. So this should surprise no one. And I think what really Ukraine has to decide, if you want to survive, you have to be able to be the agent of peace here. You have, in a way, a good political, moral argument. You're dying. Your people are suffering. Your country is being destroyed. You want it to stop. That's a very difficult argument, either for Russia or for the United States or for China. What are they going to do? Say no? But what you have is a leader, Mr. Zelensky, and I assume he speaks for a significant part of Ukrainian public opinion. He wants to keep fighting. He actually thinks that he, with the support of the West, can regain all the territory in the eastern part of Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula that Russia took earlier. The Russians have said in every way that I can understand, they won't do that. And Russia has nuclear weapons. I wish they didn't, but they do. And that you can't pretend that that's not there. They have said that this is an existential threat. All right. So for me, some deal has to be made here. I hope that the deal allows Ukraine to enjoy end of the war and to have at least a large part of what its territory was. My suspicion is they're going to have to give Russia something, but it's not clear what that something is. The West wants us to think, well, they'd have to give up their land. Well, the Russians might accept to take a certain part of the Ukraine, make it Russia. They've already done that with the 4 little sections of eastern Ukraine that they have declared are now Russia. Maybe they'll take that. But you might give them something else. Don't give them eastern Ukraine. Keep that Ukraine, but give the Russians something else they want. For example, reopen the market in Western Europe. Let the Europeans get cheap oil and gas from Russia like they have been doing for decades. That would be very good for the European economy. They would now be able to compete because the energy cost to produce everything would come down dramatically. Russia would be very happy to have again the cheap, the ability to sell massive quantities of energy indefinitely to Europe. Maybe a deal could be worked there that the Europeans get something they need and want, cheap food, cheap energy. The Russians get something they want, a market for their energy, a market for their food. Ukraine gets what it wants, territory back. It regains as much as possible of the territory lost to the Russian military over the last year and a half. But in order for this to happen, Mr. Zelensky has to be able to get up and say, that's what I want. But of course, that will make the United States and Western Europe angry. They have spent 70, 80, maybe $100 billion on that war. They want Ukraine to win and Russia to lose. But the problem is, if you do that, the Russians are showing you they are going to take Ukraine on the ground. And they're doing that. Maybe not as fast as they wanted to. Maybe at a higher cost than they thought they would have to pay. But they're doing it. And they're demonstrating that they know how to do it, that they have the technology to do it, they have the resources, they have the will, they're not falling apart economically. Those are the realities. As long as Mr. Zelensky only talks about getting the land back and dares not become a voice saying, I recognize that if the Russians give us back the land they took, they have to get something in order to give that up. And I want the West, don't give me any more arms. Don't give me more missiles. Reopen the market for Russian oil and gas, buy Russian grain, buy Ukrainian grain too. That will give the Russians something they want. Get rid of the sanctions. This will be very beneficial to Russia. China will urge Russia to take this deal, and you will save Ukraine from more horrible destruction. But Mr. Zelensky isn't doing that. If he did, it would change everything, I think. If he stood up and said, my people have suffered enough, we made an effort, we need to have peace, and we have paid the price in Ukraine with lost cities, with lost people, with refugees. We have paid the price. Europeans now have to give us what we need for peace, which is not tanks and it is not, guns. It is something that will give the Russians enough that they give us back the part of Ukraine that they took, or as much of it as that's a negotiation that gives us peace, I think. Well, let me put it this way. It may not work. I can't be sure, of course. But if you try it, you're not killing people. Try it. Try it. See if it works. Even if we say a ceasefire for 3 months while we try to work out this deal in Paris or in Warsaw or wherever it would be done, I think the whole world would applaud the end. The Ukrainian people could breathe for 3 months. Be very hard to restart a war once you did this, right? Because at the end of 3 months, everybody would say, take another month, and I think that's why we don't see this, because those who want to fight to the last Ukrainian. Look, let me be very honest with you. I don't know where are you right now? Where do you sit?
Brazil.
Okay. Let me tell you something about the United States. The vast majority of my neighbors, the people I live with, I live in New York City, so that's where I am. They don't know where Ukraine is. They have no concept. They don't know. Half of the United States is not aware that Russia and the Soviet Union are not the same thing. We had a senator, Tom Tuberville, from the state of Alabama, who became famous as he was running for the Senate, and he was elected. He's now the senator. When he was running, he said over and over again in front of television how proud he was of his father, who had been a soldier in the American Army during World War II, fighting Soviet communism. And the newspapers had to point out to him that during World War II, the enemy of the United States was not the Soviet Union, that the United States' ally was the Soviet Union, and the enemy was Adolf Hitler and Mussolini in Italy. Okay? Yeah, that's the level of understanding. In this country, no one cares about any of this. This is an unimportant battle far away. The government tries to get people all excited by painting Putin as if he were another Stalin or something like that. And, a few people get excited about it. But the vast majority of the people don't know and don't care about any of this. They're worried about their job. They're worried about whether they can afford to send their kid to school, to college, whether they can afford to pay the bills for the groceries their family needs. They're concerned about the issues immediately around them, maybe in their larger community, maybe in the United States. But in a small corner of Europe, not at all. So anyone who tells you that the United States couldn't change its policy, that's completely untrue. This is not a country invested in this struggle. Absolutely not. This is a maneuver of a conservative Democratic Party that needs a foreign enemy, and it has decided that the best way to fight China is to weaken its ally, Russia. And it is very happy to have the Ukrainian people pay the price.
You see that this fight in Ukraine is a part of the game of containing China?
Yes, absolutely. You will not understand it if you think otherwise. For the United States now understands that the last 30 years, a period of time called globalization and whatever else you want, was very profitable for the United States. It opened up China, Nixon and Kissinger back in the 1970s, and American companies are producing everything in China, very low wages, very profitable. But what they didn't understand was that the Chinese used the same 30 years to industrialize their country. And in the end, they did a better job of industrializing their country than the United States did in bringing profit to its capitalists. The United States succeeded. It brought massive profits to the United States. It's been a profitable time in the United States. But the Chinese outmaneuvered them. Economic growth for the last 30 years in the United States averaged 1.5% to 2% GDP growth per year. Over the same 30-year period, in China, 6 to 9%. China grew 2 to 3 times, year in and year out. And suddenly the United States discovers that the Chinese have become the first real competitor it has seen. And the first reaction that you could see under Trump, and the second reaction that you can see now under Biden, are the attempt to stop the Chinese, to turn it around, to close it down, to build military bases all around, to try to, what we call here, contain China. Because that was what was done with Russia. But here again, the mistake. Russia was small, weak, and poor. China isn't anymore, and that makes this strategy not work. And this is maddening for the United States. And so having the Seventh Fleet around Taiwan, fighting against Russia in Ukraine, sanctioning everybody, this is the hysterical first stage. My hope is, and it's possible, that cooler heads will prevail and a different approach to China will come afterwards.